Hi everybody, this is the supplemental lecture for Chapter 6. And for Chapter 6, I'll let the textbook chapter stand on its own. And that's a bit where we're sort of going with these videos is read the textbook chapter, and it will stand on its own for this chapter and some of the other chapters we had previously. I didn't feel like I needed to go into details about what the chapter said, so you don't need to have it read to you. These supplemental lectures uh, are meant to elaborate on some of the things that the textbook talks about. So instead of just talking about what the textbook talks about, maybe giving some additional information about some of the topics the textbook talks about. Not everything, just some. And also to introduce some material that the textbook doesn't cover and you should know. So let's go ahead and look at this. So chapter 6 is on middle childhood. And as we go through, at least through adolescence, we're going to hit Piaget and his stages of cognitive development as we go through each of these stages, each of these time periods through adolescence. And so in middle childhood, in Piaget's theory, they're going through concrete operational stage, or concrete operations for short. And so if you remember in Piaget, infants and toddlers are doing a sensory motor stage. They're learning about the world through physical manipulations, developing rudimentary ideas about cause and effect, learning a bit how their actions can influence the world in terms of those cause and effect things. And towards the end of the sensory motor stage, we have the development of language, and so what we call representational thoughts. So words, language represent other objects, other things. And then we have the pre-operational stage that we just talked about in early childhood, where kids make a lot of mistakes in logic because they center, or their centration, on some aspect of the problem. And so we, for example, had coins, and if you spread out coins versus having the coins close together, it could be the same number of coins, but the kid will notice the spread. They won't think about the number of coins. And so that's an example of centration. They confuse appearance with reality. So those scary Easter bunny pictures where just kids are scared out of their lives with the Easter bunnies. So they do a lot of logical errors, if you will, because they concentrate on just one aspect of the problem or the issue that they're dealing with. In concrete operations, we see some of those logical errors disappear. Kids can think about multiple things. They can not confuse appearance and reality. They understand that it's the number of coins, not how spread out they are. And so here in concrete operational stages, remember Piaget's model is about scientific thinking. Kids can think basically scientifically. They can think if then. However, concrete means that it has to be in front of them. They have to be able to touch it, to see it, to understand that logic. They can't think abstractly about something. So that's what concrete operations mean. So operations or operational means logic. Can you think logically? Can you think about multiple variables, multiple things at once? Can you think about sequences of things, etc.? Yes, they can, operational, but the limit here is they can only do it when the thing's in front of them. They can't think about some abstract thing that's not in front of them and follow these logical steps. It has to be in front of them. And so you can see here, this is operations. They can mentally combine, separate, order, transform. Concrete objects means it's something there that they can see and touch. And again, concrete is they experience it directly, so they can't think abstractly yet, not logically, but they can think logically about things that are in front of them. So there's decentration. So they don't focus on just one aspect of the problem, and we'll have some examples in a bit. So they're more organized in their thinking, so more scientific, if you will, and more flexible. They don't get tricked by some aspect of the problem and make mistakes. They can consider many things at once. And so we're going to talk about things in terms of Piaget's concrete operations. We're going to talk about conservation task, and we talked about this with the pre-operational, so it's just a review of that, but showing how kids progress. Reversibility, I'll talk about that with examples. Classification, planning, and metacognition. Metacognition is thinking about thinking. So kids are becoming quite logical in this stage, although again, it's only concrete, things that they're experiencing directly they can see and touch. So conservation, we have various things. So conservation just means if you essentially change the form of something, it doesn't change the essence of it. So with numbers, it could be like coins. So if I have 5 coins and I have them close together versus spreading them out far, somebody in concrete operations know the number of coins hasn't changed. Pre-operational kids get tricked. And so as they're spread out more, they think it's different. Oftentimes they think it's more. So basically that's conservation of number. So you're not changing the essence of the thing, even though it looks a little bit different. So in this case, the number of coins. Again, this is using logic alone. And there's a video on Canvas for you to watch on this. I think it's just a several minute one. So watch it. Actually, in this video, it's quite nice because there's, if I remember right, there's a pre-operational kid and there's a concrete operational kid, and you can see the difference. So you can, when you look at that, you can kind of see why Piaget was a stage theorist who thought kids think differently qualitatively at different ages. When you look at this video, the pre-operational kid is quite confused when the person, the experimenter, spreads out the coins. He's confused. The kids who are concrete operational, when you do something like that, they're like, yeah, duh, it's the same number of coins. It's like, to them, it's just so easy and so obvious that it's the same number of coins, but kids that are just a little bit younger can't do it. So you can kind of see again why Piaget thinks that there's stages. Because when you look at these kids, it's not sort of more stuff that they know. It's they totally see the world in a different way. And it's very striking when you see those differences. We have conservation of volume. So basically, you'll watch a video on this, and I think in that video there might be several conservation tasks. But basically here you have 2 pitchers or beakers, and they're the same shape and size, and they have the same amount of liquid. And then what you do is you take one of those and you pour it into a long, tall glass or container. And you do it in front of the kid. And so a kid that's pre-operational, when you do that, they think that there's more volume now. Even though it came from the same beaker as the other one, if it's in that long, skinny container, they see it's tall. They concentrate just on the height of the volume and say, oh, there's more there. A concrete operation kid will understand it's the same volume. They just saw you pour it into a different size and shape container, but it's the same volume. It just looks a little bit different in the different container. And again, the differences can be quite striking. I think in the uh, video, I don't think we have a contrast for this one, but it would be similar to the stuff that we saw with conservation of number. It's a striking difference. The kids that are pre-operational are like, whoa, that's a lot more. They get fooled. They centrate on the height. The concrete operational kids are like, it's almost like, why are you asking me this question? That's a stupid question. It's so obvious. It's the same volume. So here, the big term that I want you to know from this is reversibility. So basically, if I take the liquid in one container, I pour it in another container, and it might look different, but it's the same. And if I ask you, well, what if I pour it back in the original container, you'll say that, oh, it's the same volume. That's reversibility. The liquid doesn't change. The liquid does not change with the container. If you pour it in one container and pour it back into the another container, it doesn't change the volume. It's reversible. So again, there's a video to watch on that. It might be several minutes long again. Also, classification. So kids at this age, they start thinking logically about classification. So they call it subordinate or superordinate and subordinate classes. So just an easy way of thinking about that, you can think about animals. Under that are mammals. Under that are dogs, cats, etc. Under dogs, you have golden retrievers, you have bulldogs, you have pit bulls, you have all these different types of dogs. So those are superordinate and subclasses or subordinate classes. Kids at this stage can do that really well. I think something I see a lot is like, dinosaurs. So some kids are obsessed with dinosaurs at this age. And they know the difference between, for example, meat eaters and plant eaters and omnivores. So they have the superordinate class of dinosaurs. Then they have the subordinate classes of what they eat, meat eaters, plant eaters, omnivores. And then under that, they might even have other subordinate classes. And so if you know kids of this age, sometimes they can really enjoy doing these things. So like collecting cards, different cards, whether it's baseball cards or other types of cards. Or, kids this age, in the old days, they might have marbles and they sort their marbles. Some might sort them by the color of the marble, or others might sort it by the size of the marble, or what the marble's made of. So kids at this age kind of seems to enjoy to do this type of classification. And again, they're flexible. So if you take objects, let's just take marbles since I mentioned it. So you can take a kid at this stage, you can ask them to sort it by size. And after they sort it by size, you can say, well, can you sort it by color now? So you have maybe big ones, medium ones, and small ones in terms of size, but within those superordinate classes, they can now sort the marbles by color. They're taking in multiple criteria. They're taking in size and they're taking in color in their classification schemes. So they can think about these multiple things at once. And these things are logical. So, there's a logic to like the dinosaurs. Dinosaurs, meat eaters, plant eaters, omnivores. There's a logic to all of this classification. So it's very logical. So concrete operation kids can do this well. Pre-operational, not so much, unless they have a ton of experience with whatever they're sorting, like dinosaurs. So remember, Piaget talks about the model of thinking being like a scientist. And so scientific thinking, part of it is planning and sequences, how to solve a problem. And so this is what concrete operational kids are starting to show. there's a problem or there's a goal that they're trying to reach, they can see the steps that they need to take. Like a relatively complex puzzle. They'll understand that they need to do this step first, the second step, third step to solve the problem. So they're very planful in terms of their strategies for solving problems, for thinking about things, how to approach the world. So again, all the stuff we've been talking about, being able to decentrate, being able to think about multiple variables, being flexible in how you approach a problem, all of these are leading into this effective planning. And then concrete operational kits start showing a lot of metacognition. Metacognition is thinking about thinking. So they're able to think about their strategies to solve a problem and whether that strategy is good or bad. They can sort of, like it says here, track their success. So if they're trying to reach a certain point to solve a problem, they can sort of evaluate on the way whether they're on track to solve it or whether they're doing something that's not a good strategy. Sorry about that. That's not my dog. That's next door neighbor's dogs. So I cannot control the barking, but hopefully you can still hear me. But I mentioned this before. There is still a limitation here. We haven't reached the full scientific thinking that Piaget holds as the model. Because, again, concrete operational kids can only do these things, can only think logically if the thing's there. If it's there, they can see it, they can touch it, they have some direct experience with the thing. They can't think abstractly about something that's not present, not there. The next stage that we're going to get into, which is towards adolescence, which is formal operations. Those kids, those older kids, can think about things that they've never had before or seen before, maybe doesn't exist. So for example, let's say you want to make a car that flies. Well, how would you design it? And they can think about it without having anything in front of them. A concrete operations kit probably would need some sort of car or a model of a car or maybe some paper to draw on it, but they can't think abstractly about it. And then we talked about the other major model about development in terms of cognitive development, how people think, is more of a quantitative approach, not a stage theory, but quantitative. Is this information processing approach? We talked about that last time. So I don't want to waste your time reviewing all of this, but the model is basically like a computer. And so I don't want to review the model. If you don't understand the model, please go watch the previous chapter of the supplemental lecture. I go over it in more detail. But I want to save you time and just get into what changes are happening during middle childhood from an information processing approach. So kids' memory is increasing. So memory capacity. This can include both short-term memory, right here, but specifically long-term memory. So the hippocampus is kicking in gear, the thing in our brain that helps us form long-term memories. It's maturing. The cortex is maturing. So the places where we store the things we learn in our cortex, there's more places and there's more interconnections between the things that we store. So if you learn something about something, let's say about animals, and you learn about mammals, and then you learn something about reptiles, if you have that experience, as you're maturing, you can make connections between those things to understand animals better. So it's both short-term and long-term memory. Kids are able to pay better attention as they get older. So attention is a big thing for short-term memory, to be able to focus on some things. And we already mentioned that from Piaget's perspective, Not only is there better attention, but kids at this stage, middle childhood, can attend to multiple things at once, which is different from the kids that are younger who can't focus on more than one thing at once. So the attention is better. So it says here rapid and efficient mental operation. So what does that mean? There's good strategies. So kids as they get older in middle childhood, they have good strategies how to pay better attention to things. How do I do things to help me store things in my long-term memory? If I saw something before, how can I remember it? So retrieval strategies. So, Piaget talked about metacognition. This is related to this too. Kids in middle childhood are developing better strategies because they can evaluate and say, okay, how did I best learn this stuff? Oh, I didn't learn this stuff. That's probably not a good strategy. I need to try something else. So they can think about thinking, metacognition. They acquire new strategies. So they develop new strategies that weren't possible earlier on. So they can seek out more information. They can make links between information. So incorporating information. So I think about linking information. So the kid learns more things, they are able to connect it and say those things are related. So remember the classification thing so I'm kind of making an argument here that both Piaget and this perspective are not mutually exclusive. They can support each other. And so remember with Piaget, we talked about classification. So that's definitely part of this incorporating information. There's superordinate classes, subordinate classes. So as I'm learning more, let's say, about animals, I can connect those pieces of information. I can slide some information into what I know about reptiles. And then maybe I didn't know much about amphibians, so I create a new category. And I have to think about, well, what makes a reptile versus an amphibian? So kids are making these connections between things about how they're similar, how they're different. So this is something that's really developing a lot in middle childhood versus early childhood. Kids are being able to distinguish information that's relevant versus irrelevant. So remember that centration that Piaget talked about? So centration, kids are looking at irrelevant information. How spread out the coins are, or how tall the liquid is. That's not relevant to volume or how many coins there are. And so these kids in middle childhood are able to say, that stuff doesn't matter. I can understand the essence of something. And by the way, kids at this stage also don't mistake appearance for reality. So remember, I talked about these weird studies that they did with kids where they said, well, I have this dog and I'm going to take all of its guts out and I'm going to put the guts and the brain of a cat in the dog's skin. And if you ask a kid that's from early childhood, well, what is that animal? They'll say dog because it's a dog skin. It looks that way. If they're in middle childhood, they'll say, listen, it's the dog's skin, but it's the cat's brains and the cat's guts. It's a cat. So they're able to get to the essence of something. And then again, they're better regulators. They're better regulators of their strategies and whether the strategies work. They can think about thinking. They can also control their attention. They can control their impulses. So they're just better self-regulators. This helps them learn more and develop cognitively. We talked about better memory, so I'm not going to get into that too much. I think I've already talked about those things. Some of the strategies that we see kids start doing a lot in middle childhood are things like rehearsal. So just repeat it. ABC, ABC, ABC. Just repeat it to help remember. As they get older, they have organizational strategies. So this categorization thing that I was talking about earlier. So if I'm trying to remember something about a certain animal, I can link it to the categories I have about animals, about mammals versus reptiles versus amphibians, and that will help me remember something about specific members of those subclasses. because mammals share some characteristics together, and it will help me remember specific mammals that I encounter that I've never saw before. But if I understand they're mammals, that will help me remember stuff about that specific, unique mammal. Elaboration. So this is what using a memory strategy where they're connecting things. So remember I was saying that kids in middle childhood are starting to connect things in their cortex, things that they've learned. And so the more that you can interconnect things, the better you learn. You probably know that from school too. So, for example, if you have material in school and it just seems so abstract and you can't link it to anything, it just kind of stands on its own and you don't know how it applies to real life or you can't link it to something else, it's really hard to learn. But if you have material that you can say, oh, yes, like I've seen that before, I've seen that thing, that will help you remember. And so kids in middle childhood are starting to do this spontaneously, which means they start using this without somebody telling them that they have to or that it's a good strategy. They just start realizing that these are the better strategies that they can use. So we talked about attention. I don't think I need to go into the details there. So executive function. So part of what's going on is physically kids' prefrontal cortex is developing during real childhood. And the prefrontal cortex does a lot of executive functioning, which is basically helping them control things, control their attention, helps them evaluate different strategies, helps them enact different strategies. If you want to think about it, it's actually helping coordinate different parts of the brain. So the kids now are able to coordinate different parts of their brain to flexibly solve problems in a way that's also very planful and is full of metacognition and sort of self-evaluation. So that's the cognitive part. Let's look a little bit at social emotional development. So in middle childhood, there's developments in terms of the sense of self. Who am I? So middle childhood, the sense of self, these social emotional developments we're going to talk about briefly here, are also related to cognitive development. So when we're talking about cognitive development, it's not in isolation from social development, emotional development, developments about the self. All of these things are interconnected. Also, the brain, the physical development is not separate. These things are all interconnected in terms of development. So, middle childhood, uh, basically we're seeing that shift. So, when kids are in early childhood, it's very limited and very concrete characteristics. So, if you ask a kid, who are you? They'll say something like, I'm a boy. I wear, I like to wear Pokemon shirts. Things like that, things that are very physical, concrete, maybe behavioral, but simple things, not about something that's essentially internal. When you move to middle childhood, kids are starting to think about these more abstract, stable concepts about themselves. So I'm smart, I'm friendly, I'm happy. And so part of this is that it's abstract stuff. It's inside me. It's not just what's outside of me, not superficial things, but things that are deep and essential about me. And also part of what's developing here is that they're able to contrast themselves with other people. That's social comparison. So I can define myself by comparing myself with other kids. And that tells me what I am unique, how I'm unique from other kids. And then when we look at Erickson, so in Erickson, kids in middle childhood are uh, striving to think about themselves as having industry or inferiority. So if kids successfully navigate Erickson's stage here in middle childhood, they see themselves as industrious, as effective. They can do things. And so they can feel like they can meet the world the challenges that they meet in school and with other kids and maybe with their parents, they can deal with those things. So there's a positive sense of self. I'm efficacious. I can do things. On the other side of it, some kids learn that they're inferior, and I shouldn't say that they learn this, but they feel like they're inferior. So their environment tells them they're inferior and stupid, and they can't do things. So kids with that type of environment feel like they're not capable. So they feel a very negative sense of self. So kids are also learning about themselves through this developmental lens that Erickson talks about, and this will be largely environmental. Parents, teachers, and also other kids tell you this information. And it's really easy for kids in middle childhood to incorporate that information into the sense of self, whether it's accurate or not. So kids start thinking about themselves a little bit more, so that's more differentiated. So remember, in cognitive development, kids can think about multiple variables and factors at once, and they can think about this now about themselves. They can think about themselves cognitively. Am I smart, etc.? Am I good at math? Am I good at English? Am I good at gym? Socially, you know, what are they like socially and physically, etc. So they can think about multiple aspects of themselves, and it doesn't all go together. So if somebody's positive about their cognitive aspects, it doesn't mean they're positive about social and physical stuff. It could be different. So kids are able to evaluate separately and independently, if you will, these separate aspects of themselves, but then they add it up together, right? So in some parts they add these things together and say, well, this is me. And kids differ. So some kids may emphasize one thing over another. So maybe they're smart and friendly, but maybe they're not good at sports. And that kid might actually feel very negative about themselves because their social environment maybe emphasizes sports. So they can think differentiatedly, but it's not like an average. Some of these things can mean more to the kid than others because of the social environment. So there's integration, which means that, again, remember cognitively, kids can think about multiple variables, multiple things at once. So kids can think about these multiple things about themselves at once and integrate it. And when you talk to a kid in middle childhood, you'll see that they can have a very complex sense of themselves. Some positive aspects, maybe some negative aspects, but still all them. And kids at this age in middle childhood not only are comparing themselves to other kids, but they're also comparing themselves to ideally, what should I be? So part of the evaluations of the self at this age is also in terms of I should be this way. In these aspects, I am this way. In these other aspects, I'm not. So there's this comparison with what I'm actually am and the ideal self. That ideal self could be from the kids' standards, or more likely it's from adults or parents in the environment. And kids, obviously, who have a lot of difference between their actual self and their ideal self are susceptible to negative self-esteem and various maybe depressive disorders and things like that. Just checking where we are. Not too bad. And so we just talked about that. So uh, if there's a lot of discrepancy between the ideal and the actual self, that's not good. It can be motivation, but I'd say more likely for kids in middle childhood, it could be a sense of discouragement and depression. So again, we talked about this. Kids are starting to compare themselves with other people, especially their social group. So around this age, kids are starting to tune into a specific social group, and that social group can carry a lot of weight. Also, kids are being exposed to media at this age. In the old days, it would have been TV, and there still might be a sense of that, but probably we're talking about social media, which could be quite dangerous, obviously. So social media may present people's lives in certain ways that's not realistic, and then you have middle kids in middle childhood starting to compare themselves socially with other people. They may not understand that those are idealized portrayals of people that on social media, and that might set them up for very negative self thoughts. Like, oh my gosh, look at these other people. They have such great lives. I don't have a great life. I have a boring life. So kids in middle childhood start being sensitive to these things and could be susceptible to some negative impacts from social media. And we talked about this already. So uh, kids in early childhood, when they talk about themselves, tend to talk about superficial external characteristics. Kids in middle childhood start talking about the essence of them, more internal characteristics. It makes me think of that interesting dog experiment. So, you take a dog, you take out its guts and brains, and you put a cat's guts and brains in there. It's a cat because its essence is a cat, the brains and the guts. It's the same thing for me. I'm not going to think about myself in terms of the skin I'm in. I'm going to think about myself in terms of my internal characteristics. And then with moral development, so as we think about this in terms of cognitive and social development, there's also, on self development, we also have moral development doing the same thing. So, in terms of moral development, kids in early childhood are about rewards and punishments. So, something is good or bad because I was punished or I was rewarded. Something good happened, something bad happened. Kids, as they get into middle childhood, start judging people's actions about the essence of it. Was the essence good? Was the intention good? Or was the intention bad and negative? But in middle childhood, they're not quite, super moral beings. They're still relying a lot of societal rules and standards. So, what is right and wrong in terms of the intention of the behavior is about societal rules, not about your personal philosophy, which develops later in adolescence. So for Piaget, he talks about this in terms of uh, heteronomous to autonomous. And so heteronomous is basically you're using outside standards of right and wrong in terms of the consequences. So this is this little bullet point here. So consequences, especially in terms of did I get rewarded or did I get punished? If I got rewarded, it was something good. If I got punished, it was something bad. But now they're turning to more autonomous morality, which is regardless of what happened, did the person intend something good? Or did they intend something bad? So a little bit more, internal motivation. And for Piaget, kids develop this through things like games. And actually, Piaget and other developmentalists probably would caution parents nowadays because a lot of kids in middle childhood are overscheduled, right? They're overscheduled in adult-oriented, adult-run activities, whether that's baseball, basketball, soccer, or anything else, where the adults are there and the adults are relatively imposing the rules. Piaget would say that's not good. You should let kids just play on their own. Because for Piaget, kids playing on their own in middle childhood, what happens is that they construct with each other rules of new games that they make up. And for Piaget, that's the seed of morality. Don't, as opposed to adult oriented stuff that I was just talking about, where parents and adults are telling you, here's the rules and here's good and bad, or right and wrong, or you're safe or out, or you're shooting correctly, or you're batting correctly, or you're not, or you're throwing wrong, or you're throwing well. Kids just naturally make up their own games. They create rules, they agree about those rules, they might modify the rules, but the kids are learning things about fairness in the rules and standards and why you have those rules. The rules are there to be fair, to make sure that everybody enjoys the game. But these are rules that they create in games that they create. There might be like some common core of it, like they might start off with a tag game, but they start modifying the rules and creating rules around that. For Piaget, that activity is essential for moral development. So Piaget would say that we're going off track with this overscheduling, adult-oriented movement for kids in middle childhood now. And let's just talk about peer relationships quickly. So remember, we said cognitively, in terms of the self, kids are starting to compare themselves to other people and defining themselves through those comparisons. And then part of the social development in terms of relationships, social status is starting to become important. And this is something that becomes more important as the kid goes through middle childhood. So there's social structures and social strata and social groups are starting to form now. And so there's things like dominance hierarchies. So who's high up in the social structure and who's low and who's in the middle. In middle childhood, that might relate to bullying, for example. And they also look at, and this is a bit related. There's also popularity. They call this sociometric. It just means that you can actually go into schools and you'll ask kids, and you can basically nominate kids, like you rank them. And so nominate, and they usually don't do the whole group. Usually it's like rank the top 5 most popular kid from based on your opinion. And what they find is that there's relative agreement to this, and they can determine this popularity structure. In terms of that research, that sociometric research, they find kind of 4 classes of kids. There's the popular kids, which means they get a lot of nominations from different people. They're ranked by different people. There's, unfortunately, the rejected kids. Basically, they get no nominations. Nobody seems to like them or think they're popular. In fact, sometimes in this research, they might ask about kids that are not popular. Rejected kids would be not just lacking popularity, they would be the ones that are nominated for being unpopular. People don't like them. There's neglected kids. They don't get a lot of popularity rankings, if any, but they don't get unpopular. They're almost like invisible kids. Nobody seems to really like them that much. Nobody seems to really hate them that much. They're just kind of there, or they're not really noticed. And there's controversial kids. Controversial kids are some people, and usually it's a small percentage. When I say small percentage, it's probably towards 20, 30% at least. Say, yeah, they're really popular, but other people say no, they're unpopular. So these might be, for example, bullies. So there might be a group of people that admire the bullies, and there's a group of people that don't like them. So those are controversial kids. People have different opinions about them. In peer relationships in middle childhood, we see a lot of gender segregation, at least within our culture. This is something that can vary across cultures. But within American culture, there's the outbreak of cooties, right? So cooties, oh, I don't want to touch girl stuff. I don't want to do girl things. And vice versa, boy things. And so there's this gender segregation where there's a push towards same-sex groups. And this can lead to more gender-type behaviors, gender-type play preferences, and a belief in kids that there's a male boy way to do things and a girl way to do things. Again, I think there's a lot of cultural differences with this. And I think in our culture, we have pretty strong gender norms that kids pick up on, and it shows up in these things. But it's, the cootie epidemic is not pervasive. So there are situations where boys and girls will play together, um, usually in smaller numbers, because you need to if there's smaller numbers. But if you have more kids, more likely they're going to segregate by gender, at least in America. We have the development of friendship. So uh, kids are now developing special relationships. So it's not just somebody you hang out with and just do things with, but there's an intimacy. There's an emotional intimacy that's strong. Because remember, kids at this age are starting to think about the essence of things, essence of cognitive problems, essence of who I am, essence of morality. They're also thinking about essence of relationships. So what makes us friends? It's the intimate, deep quality stuff, not just we hang out together. And kids are now starting to define friends separately from just kids they hang out with at school, peers. So this is a really big marker because now kids are thinking more deeply about those intimate aspects of relationships in terms of friendships. And this will influence development of dating relationships and romantic relationships later in adolescence. And so this is the stage where kids are starting to develop those ideas. Initially, it is in sort of not sexual peer relationships, and then it will grow into those um, deep, intimate, romantic relationships. And so that's it for this supplemental lecture. And so I will make another supplemental lecture for the next chapter. And take care.